So we've got a lot to get to today, so we're going to start and kick things off. This will be recorded and we will be sending out the slides later. So for those of you who have to step out for a moment or anyone coming in late, you'll be able to get the full run up here. So thank you all for making time to attend today's webinar, Introducing Food Innovation in the Context of Space Health. I'm Matt McNulty, the Associate Director for the Tufts University Center for Cellular Agriculture, and I'm excited to talk to you today about how we can engage the future food community in space health. And for myself, I have experience with both the future food community, but in a former life, I was also a NASA Space Technology Research Fellow and have been involved with sort of their biomanufacturing foods efforts for a number of years. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk on this platform and to be working with colleagues at UC Davis and Tufts through our Trish-funded project. So the webinar today will have 3 different segments: introducing future foods for space, that'll be me starting us off, and then I'll be passing over to our guest speaker, Dr. Gioia Massa, project scientist at NASA Kennedy Space Center. And finally, we'll end with some Q&A. We'll have a few minutes for Q&A, but I'd please encourage anybody as questions arise to put them into the Q&A box. Any that we aren't able to directly answer today, just over the webinar, we will be following up answers through when we send out sort of our slides, PDFs afterwards. So all questions will be considered. So to kick us off, I want to first introduce the Future Foods for Space program, which is sort of an overarching program that we're kicking off here that these webinars are a part of. So this is funded by TRISH, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. And you can see more about TRISH. You can follow this blue box later on when we send over the PDF. We'll have a series of different resources that are linked in blue so that you can follow them up on your own time. And the goal of our project, the Future Foods for Space program, is to prepare a diverse group of faculty, postdocs, and industry researchers to lead successful research programs in space health, focusing on astronaut food challenges, which span food matrices, health outcomes, and logistics. So we're really just kicking off here with the educational webinar series, this being the first webinar of several planned. But we plan to then also launch a mentorship network, have a research and innovation training workshop, new investigator pilot research projects, and finally, research and innovation symposium over the next 2 years. So this is with Tufts, UC Davis, and with Trish, as I mentioned before. As far as the webinar content, first we are introducing the basic context of space health for the future foods community. In the second webinar, we will be looking at opportunities that exist once you understand a little bit of the context of the space health. And then third, once you're interested in engaging in opportunities, what are some tools that can help you be effective in engaging in those opportunities? And this is today. So when we say future foods, I think a lot of people have different definitions. And so here's our definition. Really, future foods refers to innovative and sustainable food products and ingredients that are developed through advanced technologies and scientific research. Some key areas within this, not exhaustive at all, so would include cellular agriculture, alternative proteins, and plant-based systems. We also consider other food tech solutions as a part of this, but that is some of our team's focus areas. We also consider that there are some general motivating characteristics for future foods, including the growing global food demand, public health concerns, animal welfare, food security and defense, nutrition and health, and environmental sustainability. We think that the future foods community is nicely positioned to actually sort of diffuse into the space health domain, more so than traditional food. If you look here at this Venn diagram, you can see quite a nice overlap in terms of space health. Also needs to consider sort of food as medicine. So more than just the nutrition input of the food is considered here. So sort of holistically, what are some of the benefits of food? Additionally, future foods often is about taking existing technologies or concepts and applying them in a way that allows you to produce a product at lower costs than have been by several order of magnitude sometime than have been achieved so far. And in that way, there's minimal resource utilization. As we'll learn more about, that is pivotal for space health as well. And lastly, sustainability is another of what I'm defining as 3 shared areas here. So what I will say about this is from this perspective, space health is often more stringent in those 3 shared domains. And by orienting towards space, this will not only benefit the space community, but it pushes us to think of solutions that promote accessibility, sustainability, and equity that can be applied to the food systems at large. So really another way that the community talks about this is sort of the spin-off paradigm. So when I transition out of now a little bit of intro to our program and into food for space in general, I want to start off with what has been the history of this space spin-off paradigm. Gotta have a good animation in there. So this is really in which you have technologies developed for space exploration that can be applied for broader societal impacts. So when we look at what's been done for food so far, you can see some examples including freeze-dried ice cream, food 3D printing, and metallicized food packaging. But the spin-off paradigm extends much further than the actual food-related products themselves and into deeply embedded food processes. So actually, the hazard analysis and critical control point system, which the FDA now uses for regulating food production processes, first came about for Apollo astronauts and was later then coined into and sort of formed into the system that we're all familiar with. And so I think by highlighting this, I hope it shows how deep some of the constraints of space can be meaningful in creating systems on Earth. But now that we've talked about some of the translation between terrestrial and space systems, let's get into the nitty-gritty on how food is different in space. I think a great way to start is by the story of the corned beef contraband. So back in 1965 for the Gemini 3 mission, we had our pilot Young here actually stuffed a corned beef sandwich into his astronaut suit, into his spacesuit. And during their 5-hour space flight, just about an hour or so in, he took his corned beef sandwich out of his pocket and offered to share with his commander. We don't know exactly what happened up there, but we can say that there's started to be crumbs that came off of the sandwich. And crumbs can ruin a mission in space. So when you have crumbs, they can get in the astronaut's eyes. Through microgravity, they can spread more and interfere with instrument panels, thinking about air filtration systems and longer duration missions. And so even something as simple as having a crummy toasted sandwich can be catastrophic. So food in space is different. A little fun fact for everybody who loves their history, they actually flew that sandwich back down, and when it touched down, they preserved that corned beef sandwich in resin, and you can now see it at the Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. So if you're ever around, please go and check it out if you like your corned beef. But it's not just crumbs that we have to worry about. So here in this introduction that I'm giving, I'm going to very lightly touch on the different food system challenges in space. These bullet points here represent some of the larger buckets. So the first are long shelf life requirements. So depending on the exploration mission scope, the shelf life requirement is more or less important, but you need shelf lives that are longer, much longer than typically what targets are terrestrially. You're also limited by mass and volume constraints. So in this way, you need to think about everything that you're bringing up from Earth to space. It's very expensive to launch anything. And so you have typically constrained environments, and every extra bit of mass that you add has a huge sort of associated penalty to the mission objectives. So you need to be very mindful of that. There's also limited cold storage. And not only are minimizing crumbs important, but also free liquids. Heating becomes an interesting constraint where you have some limited heating capabilities, but you also then don't have convection in space, so heating is going to work a little differently. You need to think particularly about degradation of the food over time, with particular emphasis on some labile nutrients, for example, your vitamin B1, B9, C, and K. You also have limited cleaning reagents. So there are water rations daily and the very limited ability to use harsh cleaning liquids. So you need to keep that in mind for your food preparations. You also have very close quarters where the different subsystems are quite integrated. So even something like aromas coming off from a kitchen might be problematic in which they can spread to other sort of subsystems and impact other activities ongoing. And lastly, speaking of other activities ongoing, astronauts have very limited time availability. And so the food preparation itself, there is limited time that can be put into that. So with these different challenges just very briefly highlighted over here, there have been some nice summaries about how do you consider those challenges, and then what does a space food system need to actually consider to be robust and fit some of these challenges. So you need to think across different dimensions, including nutrition, usability, so that's about the human crew time, so the human factor. You need resource minimization, reliability is very huge, and you also need redundancy as part of that, because that's another way to bolster reliability. Menu fatigue is a significant concern, so you need to think about variety of your food system. Palatability is also an important consideration here, and it's also then sometimes confounded by the fact that you have some pressure shifts and then have altered senses of smell and taste that could be considered. You need to think about stability of your foods, safety from a microbial, physiological, and chemical risks perspective. So now that we've outlined some of what the key considerations are in response to challenges, how do we actually implement, like what do our food systems look like that need to consider all these different factors here? Well, really, I think one way to think about it is that there's two different types of food systems that you can have in space. There are prepackaged foods, which I would say are simple but rigid, just to sort of very, very simply define them. And then you have biomanufactured foods or bioregenerable foods, which are flexible but complex. We'll have Dr. Gioia Massa going in more depth about some example of bioregenerable foods systems in more detail in some of the challenges and unique solutions that come about with that in a space environment for her portion of this webinar. To quickly detail some of what the pros and cons are across these different subsystems so that you can begin to weigh what their respective advantages are. For prepackaged foods, you have minimal infrastructure, which is really important for that mass and volume constraint that we talked about. It's also quite easy to prepare and reliable. So all the preparation is done terrestrially, or most of it is done terrestrially. So there's a little risk associated with food preparation. But because of that, you then have to bring it all with you. And so if you're looking at a longer mission, say to Mars, something like on the order of 10,000 kilograms of food that might be required, that is a really high mass all of a sudden that you need to bring with you. There are also fixed quantities associated with prepackaged foods. So if the mission specifications change due to some unforeseen circumstances, or if the food subsystem is compromised, it's more difficult to adapt, especially as you get longer out and resupplies become more costly with a longer time delay. And lastly, you have the nutrient degradation within prepackaged foods, which can be considered and sort of mitigated against through packaging, but also different food innovation. On the biomanufactured food side of things, they're flexible, they provide psychological support. So through this concept of biophilia, where it's really psychologically beneficial to be nurturing and around other living organisms. And they also provide an avenue to replenish these nutrients that degrade over time into prepackaged foods. However, it's a complex infrastructure. There are more failure modes because now you're bringing the whole food preparation with you on the mission in a very constrained environment. And it also then requires a lot more crew time, and there are safety implications. With all of that in mind, really what we're seeing so far as far as what the food systems look like are prepackaged foods. That is the majority of the dietary intake. So when we have these low Earth orbit missions, we have resupply shuttles that are sent to the ISS that contain adequate nutrients, and that's the primary focus right now. The food forms, the forms here can include rehydratable foods, thermostabilized, irradiated, and natural form foods. What I really want to note to this community, which we will go into in more detail in subsequent webinars, is NASA's baseline value and assumptions document, the BVAD, for life support guidelines. So if you're curious, what are the assumptions to use for metabolic activity of the crew, or even of how to consider food systems and the mass that's generally been considered associated with different food operations. And what does the dietary intake need to look like? All of that is in the BVAD and more. So it's a really great resource for when you start to turn that key and reorient research and get more detailed there. So far, we're really focused on the low Earth orbit or towards the International Space Station. But as you start thinking of missions that are longer duration, say going to the moon or to the gateway around it or out to Mars, you have more complex missions that are longer in duration, and it begins to shift the balance of what makes sense between prepackaged foods and biomanufactured foods. This play is very much still being resolved, and there's a lot of room for innovation here to understand what that balance is. And as we're exploring different missions, really there are a series of 5 broad categories of hazards that then have very different types of risks and health consequences associated with them, depending on what that mission architecture looks like. So NASA's 5 broad hazards here are distance from Earth, confinement, hostile enclosed environments, altered gravity fields, and radiation. In response to these hazards, you can see a series of different risk and health consequences here, such as infections, alterations to nutrition and mood, sleep disruption, stress. You could have oxidative stress, vision changes, bone loss, and so forth. How this is typically thought about from a risk management perspective is you have these risks, which then you have a series of different analyses and experimentation to identify, to model, and predict. And here, these experimentations and analyses methods largely can be bucketed as space environmental monitoring. You have temporal astronaut monitoring and ground simulation and flight tests. With this analysis of identifying these risks, this also then allows you to identify what are some adequate countermeasures to these risks to space health. So when we think about the larger picture of the space health risk, there's a series of different countermeasure categories that have been considered in response. So you've got autonomous health support, cognition and psychological evaluation, specialized workout equipment, and so forth. So within personalized medicine here, I think what could be specifically called out for this community's interest is it's back to the corned beef. Probably not back to the corned beef, but in this case, personalized nutrition is a consideration here. So really, what is food as a countermeasure? So when you think of food as a subsystem, really, I think that it can be viewed as a countermeasure here and used to respond to some of these risks. So to understand what some of these risks are and the relative impact on the mission that's being predicted out right now, there are a couple of ways to really get oriented quickly to this. So what I'm showing you here, this image is actually a summary of some of the risk profiles that are expected for the different health risks that are listed here across different mission architectures. So from low Earth orbit all the way to planetary visit and habitat. You can see that the risk level is coded by color. And as you get to longer duration missions, the space health risk in general becomes more heavily weighted. That's where you see the high risks here. And so I would highly recommend that anybody who's interested in digging down deeper into what the different space health risks are that can then be associated with nutrition, or you can think about food as a countermeasure to them, I would direct you to NASA HRP's Human Research Roadmap, where they really have comprehensive information about the risk and evidence-based reports that can help you orient quite quickly. Again, these blue boxes, once we send out the PDF of the slides later, you can click on them and it'll take you directly to this resource, in this case, the Human Research Roadmap. With that in mind, as you're orienting, wanted to give you an opportunity to see very quickly what are some recent Trish-funded research topics here. So you can see the topics that might be related to the future foods community or of interest to them, including the relationship between the gut microbiome and physical and mental health, genetically engineered plants, improved texture and appearance of food after longer storage, and modeling of health-related systems and devices to track digestion in space. As those are just a couple recent ones of what's been funded, I think I just want to give you a quick snapshot in terms of how to think about what's coming next. As you're thinking through some of these risk profiles, there's some sort of overarching research guidance that NASA puts out for its different elements. So here, we have a decadal survey that looks out over the next 10 years. Recently, there was one for the biological and physical sciences. It's linked here. I'll just highlight one recommendation that we'll be looking forward to the next 10 years here, which is that they want to create a stronger connection between the technology development in biological and physical sciences and the health outcomes associated with the human research program. And so here we can see Future Foods can offer a holistic approach by facilitating connection between the healthcare side and the food production side. Just to say, I know we talked about the webinars before, and I think I gave you some teasers at the end about some of what the researchers' environment is looking like. If you want to hear more about that in more detail, our next webinar, stay tuned for it to be announced, will be on the opportunities for the Future Foods for Space community, which includes what are some of the key organizations and literature, and what are some ways to get involved, and what are the funding avenues looking like. With that, I would like to turn things over to our guest speaker, Dr. Gioia Massa. It's my pleasure to introduce her. She's been a NASA scientist at Kennedy Space Station, working on space crop production for the International Space Station and future exploration endeavors. So thank you for your attention so far. And Gioia, I'll let you kick things off from here.
Awesome. Wonderful intro, Matt. Thank you. I think you'll need to enable screen sharing for me to.
Yep, so you should be good now.
Okay, I'm gonna throw that one up there. Okay, hi everyone. It's great to be here today, and it's great to help kick this off. I'm going to talk with you a bit about our research in space crop production. So I think you can see the slides okay. So I'm at Kennedy Space Center. So Kennedy is actually the NASA center that has plant research for the agency. So we work both on the kind of the fundamental plant space biology side of things, as well as the space crop production. And we help enable, external investigators to do their work in NASA's facilities or on the International Space Station. We work very closely with Johnson Space Center, which has the food group. And we work very closely with Ames Research Center, which conducts research more on animals and cell biology. And all of the NASA centers that I mentioned work with microbiology, which is a key part of everything that we work on. So I'm a senior project scientist there, working in the area primarily in space crop production. And so, why are we interested in growing plants in space? First of all, for the food. Food is one of our primary drivers. And I love this image in the bottom left of astronaut Mike Hopkins when he was on space station, showing a Thanksgiving dinner. And, all of the food is individually packaged. A lot of it's freeze-dried or thermostabilized. It's actually quite a good food system. There's over 180 food items, another 20 or so beverages and condiments. So there are a couple of challenges, though, and as Matt mentioned, one is with storage. Depending on how you store the food, and a lot of this also is being found to depend on temperature of storage, the vitamins can break down and the quality can degrade. Another aspect, though, is menu fatigue. We're on about a 9-day diet. If you ate all of the foods, it would be like every 9 days. And what research has shown is that astronauts generally are losing weight on space station. And these are not people who need to lose weight. They're exercising quite a lot, and maintaining their weight is important. So we think that potentially this may be due to menu fatigue, as well as, other unknown aspects. And that's something that NASA is currently studying. At the same time that you're growing plants for food and for dietary variety, they may provide the psychological benefits that Matt mentioned, that little piece of earth that you take with you when you're living and working in a stressful environment. And plants may have roles in life support. They take up the carbon dioxide that we're breathing out, and they generate oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. They also can help transpire the water through their process of evapotranspiration, taking water that maybe is not totally clean and making, water vapor that can be condensed and reused because it's totally pure at that point. So there may be a lot of roles for plants moving forward, and we envision this kind of changing over time. Our space crop production team has a vision of ensuring food system security on long duration missions beyond low Earth orbit. And by food security here, I mean the condition in which the crew have continuous access to sufficient safe and nutritious food, which meets both their dietary needs and their preferences in order to maintain peak health and performance. So plants may be an important part of this food system. And in the near term, that's going to look like supplementing the packaged diet with fresh produce. So near-term missions are going to rely on physical, chemical, environmental control and life support systems. So pumps and filters and lots of machines to clean the air and the water. But having the stowed food, the packaged diet, and supplementing with the fresh food. However, long term, we want to move in the direction of Earth independence. And so we can start to grow crops that provide calories. And so for future long duration habitation, bioregenerative life support, including plants, can be added and expanded to increase autonomy and Earth independence. So that kind of looks like this. Right now, we're focused on doing research on the ground and on the International Space Station. We're looking at crop research. So again, research to try to develop production. We're working on developing a space crop production approach for the space station. Again, on the Gateway and the early lunar missions, we'll focus primarily on research. But hopefully by the time we have, an outpost on the moon, we'll be able to start doing regular supplemental nutrition. And as we expand the outpost and as we travel on to Mars, we feel that supplemental nutrition will become more important and become a larger part of the diet. So right now, we're focusing on the left-hand side of this chart. We're growing our salad crops, our microgreens and herbs, things that can be picked and eaten fresh without a lot of processing, and that can supplement the diet, not just with the vitamins, but also with flavor, with textures that you wouldn't otherwise get in the packaged diet. The staple crops are going to take a little more work. It's not that they're harder to grow. It's just that we don't really have the infrastructure to support processing them. So white potato and sweet potato you need a way to cook them. And as Matt mentioned, right now we have some heating capabilities on the ISS, but we don't really have cooking capabilities. We have a food warmer, but we don't really have a microwave or an oven. So that would be needed for those types of crops to be integrated into the diet. For things like wheat and soybean, you're going to need even more equipment. You'll have to have your threshing equipment, your milling equipment, your bread machines and pasta makers and tofu presses. And all of that, it's not just a lot of stuff to launch from Earth and to develop miniaturized and reliable, but it's also going to take either a tremendous amount of crew time, which probably isn't an option. When we have astronauts on the moon, they're going to be going out and doing things on the moon. And same with on Mars. They're not going to have time to do subsistence farming. So we're going to need the robotics and the automation to automate all of those processes, or as many of them as possible. So it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. When we think about plant growth, we have 5 cardinal factors for plants to grow anywhere well. They have to be within a certain range. So these include temperature, light, moisture, nutrients, and atmosphere. And in the space environment, these may behave differently. So, especially in microgravity, we have no natural convection. And so we have to mix the air using forced convection to be able to distribute temperature, to be able to distribute atmosphere. We may also use water to move heat away from things, for instance, because we just don't have natural convection without gravity. Um, light, light so far seems to behave the same in plants on Earth and in space, but we're still learning more about this. But we can use the light to modify key plant characteristics. So we could use an altered light spectrum to try to get, for instance, enhanced beneficial nutrients from the crops. Fertilizer is really heavy, so we have to figure out how to recycle things that might be considered wastes to generate those fertilizers. How do we take our inedible plant material, like our leaves and stems of a tomato plant, and break that down to grow the next tomato plants? And what human wastes can we use in this process? And then water is a really strange one. Water and air don't mix well in microgravity. You'll get a bubble of air inside kind of a shell of water, almost like a peanut M&M. And plant roots are not photosynthesizing. They are respiring just like we are. So they need the oxygen in the root zone. So we have a lot of challenges watering our plants without gravity. We don't really understand partial gravity. So we need to learn more about that. So that leads me to these kind of characterization of our challenges. We have some that are specific for low Earth orbit and deep space, such as the fluid movement, lack of convection, and microgravity. Some that are going to be specific to surfaces, such as the moon or Mars. Dust and regolith, maybe getting into equipment could cause some problems. Partial gravity, again, is not very well understood. These are kind of shared between both environments, these in pink. Radiation is going to be a huge issue once we leave Earth's protective electromagnetic field. Pressure will be operating at reduced pressures in a lot of these habitats, and how to, we deal with micrometeorites. These down at the bottom in green are relevant for any terrestrial agricultural system as well. How do we get good productivity? How do we tolerate the stresses that we're exposed to? How do we optimize for our environment or schedule things in a way that makes sense? And then these in the middle are kind of our unique challenges. We don't have a lot of space to grow plants, so we want very compact plants. We're growing in a high CO2 environment because we have humans living and working in there, and it's sealed. We have specific food safety concerns, specific nutrient output concerns, and we want to grow all of this and do all of this sustainably with a lot of different weird stresses and limited resources. So on the International Space Station, we are growing crops right now in two large plant capabilities. One is veggie. Veggie is a really simple system. It's more like an astronaut garden. It's very low power, low mass, but it requires a lot more intensive activity by the crew. And the environment is maintained by the space station environment for the most part. APH, Advanced Plant Habitat, is what we call Veggie's big sister. APH has over 180 sensors, and it controls every aspect of that environment. It can be controlled from the ground. So it's more of a plant physiology research chamber. And we're learning lessons from both of these that are helping to contribute to the development of space crop production capabilities. And we have a chamber in work right now that will be more of a production test bed rather than a research chamber. So this is Veggio 1B. This was the harvest of red romaine lettuce in August 2015. And I show this video because this was actually the first time the crew got to eat the crops growing in veggie. We had a previous grow out. We had a lot of challenges with the watering, but we got some plants to grow, brought samples back, did food safety analysis, and worked through a very extensive process to get approval for the crew to grow and eat this second crop. It took about a year. And again, this is all new with NASA, so we didn't really have procedures in place for it. We do have the crew sanitize the produce using a a sanitizing wipe that they put the leaves in between layers of wipe and sort of press for 30 seconds. And it's a prophylactic sanitization approach. And then after that, they got to eat this lettuce, and you can see they toast with it, as we all do with our lettuce. But here we have Kimia Yue, Chell Lindgren, and Scott Kelly, eating the first lettuce that they could eat out of veggie. And it was a big deal. They made some speeches about it, which was pretty awesome for our team to hear. And Scott talked about the logistical complexity of having people live and work in space for long periods and the supply chain that's needed. And also how for Mars, we need a spacecraft that's more self-sustainable. Chell, who's a physician, talked about the benefits of eating the fresh food, the contributions of the plants to that small ecosystem of the ISS, and the psychological benefit of growing plants in that environment. So it was really great with their remarks. They really encompassed all of the things that our team had been thinking. We sent a second veggie unit, and here you can see Scott Tingle showing his gardening skills. Here we did mixed cropping. We've also, prior to this, added repetitive harvests. So initially it was just a one-time harvest, but then we added what we call cut and come again repetitive harvests to the crops. And here we have two veggies that are slightly offset in time. They were started a few days apart so that the plants could be harvested every couple of days during the repetitive harvest period to try to get a feel for what continuous crop production would look like. We've grown a number of other crops inside veggie, including red Russian kale, which is actually a kale that tastes pretty darn good fresh, dragoon lettuce, a soft butterhead lettuce, wasabi mustard. This one's got a spicy wasabi flavor. Extra dwarf pak choy. This is a crispy, juicy baby bok choy, and Amara mustard, which has sort of a meaty profile. It's also called Ethiopian kale, but we nicknamed it the steak plant. And two of these crops were actually selected by middle and high school students in an education outreach program that we have in partnership with the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden in Miami called Growing Beyond Earth. Currently, we have around 500 schools in this school year that will be participating in this program. This is the 9th year of the program. And the students are helping test different crops and different horticultural approaches for growing crops in space. So it's a citizen science research project that we're very proud of. We've grown tomatoes, and we had some challenges with this. This is what they looked like in our pre-flight ground testing. These were dwarf tomatoes, and you can see they look pretty good, a few dead leaves, but not too bad. However, in flight, this is what happened. We had drying issues early on, which led to some germination issues and uneven growth. And then we had excess water later on, which led to flower and fruit drop, as well as some abnormal growth that we had. So we didn't have enough fruit for the astronauts to try them in this experiment, which was disappointing for us and for them. But we were able to still collect a lot of data and learn a lot about growing plants in this environment. We realized veggie, because it's manually watered by the astronauts and because tomato are such a long duration crop, it's really not ideal to do in that type of a garden compared to the leafy crops. But we've also learned a lot about microbiology in our veggie experiments. Here are just some microbial plots comparing the Veg 03 red romaine lettuce to that grown in our chambers on Earth and compared to what we get in a grocery store. And you can see generally that all of the samples were pretty comparable to the grocery store, except in one of our Veg 03 experiments. And I don't have all the experiments lined up here, but what we see is there just are differences between experiments that aren't necessarily related to the plants, but maybe more related to when things are grown on the ISS and the conditions of the ISS at the time. We've done microbiome studies with a lot of our plant samples as well. And here are the Veg 05 tomato microbiome heat maps. And you'll see that there are some differences between flight and ground in terms of fruit, leaves, roots, and those adventitious roots, the roots that grew above ground. But generally, we see more differences between tissue type than we do see between flight and ground. So generally, they're pretty consistent between flight and ground. But there are a few things that stand out that we start to look at. We've also grown crops in APH. So advanced plant habitat, again, like I said, it has a lot more capabilities than veggie. And this set of radishes was grown in APH. This was an experiment by Professor Carl Hassenstein from the University of Louisiana Lafayette, where he was studying radish growth and took a lot of different samples, but he also had the opportunity for the crew to eat the radishes, which was pretty exciting. We've since done chili peppers. So this was the PH04 experiment where the Espanola improved hatch chili peppers were grown on the space station. That was done in November 2021, and the astronauts got to eat some space tacos from these chili peppers. And we have upcoming PH07, where we're going to be growing our favorite red romaine lettuce again, but intentionally trying to understand the water stress. Using the capabilities of APH, we're going to be intentionally exposing plants to different water conditions in their substrate. So we have a control, which should be an optimal, well-watered plant, and then we have a flooded treatment, a drought treatment, and an intermittent treatment where after growing optimally for a couple of weeks, we'll shut the water off, let the plants draw it down until they wilt, and then reset it. And the goal of this is to really understand the impacts on the plants, but also on their microbiomes, so that we can understand what are good failure modes for crop production systems in the future, not just for that specific grow out, but for the entire ecosystem that the plant human microbiome occupies. So this will be launching at the end of October this year. So our key crop plant takeaways are that we have data that indicate the astronauts enjoy growing and eating the plants in spaceflight. Not terribly surprising, but it's really good to get data to show these things. We have found that crop yield is generally similar between ground and flight when the plants are not stressed, but reducing that stress is a big challenge. We do see some differences between ground and flight nutrient content in the plants, but they're not consistent between species or between experiments. And so things like the type of the crop, the type of the harvest scenario, whether it's a one and done or repetitive harvest, and then other environmental conditions seem to be impacting the nutrient contents in the crops. We see some microbial counts and compositions varying between the flight and ground-grown plants, and we often see microbes typical of the space station environment associated with the ISS-grown plants, and not as much on the ground, because we're growing our plants for our ground controls in chambers that no one's living in. We go inside and we wear a lab coat, we wear gloves. Whereas the ISS is someone's home. These astronauts are living and working there. And so there is a microbiome that's very unique to that environment that we just don't replicate on the ground. We've only rarely seen human pathogens on our plants. And when we've seen them, they were at levels very much below level of concern. So we do scan regularly for human pathogens, E. coli, Salmonella, and Staph aureus. And we have seen Staph aureus, which is a skin-associated microorganism, on one plant in one experiment at levels below concern. We see variation between shoot and root tissues in their community analysis, but not as much between flight and ground. And overall, I would say the plants adapt well to the space environment. They're very plastic in their growth. So they can adapt to their conditions just because they have to. That's what they do on Earth. They can't move, they can't run away, they can't put on a coat, so they adapt. And they do the same thing in space. To date, the space-grown crops are safe to eat, nutritious, and highly acceptable to the astronauts. So our team has characterized the gaps that we have in knowledge and technology And we have what we call a living list of around 65 different gaps, falling into different areas relating to crops, ecosystems, and hardware. And so we have some gaps in things like crop performance, and food safety, horticulture, but also gaps in technology like environmental control and monitoring and systems architecture. And then we have some gaps in the interactions like human plant interaction. So this is just sort of a snapshot of some of our gaps, but um, key gaps for space crop production. One of them is that we just haven't had an opportunity to test that many crops. We've really only tested about 10 or 11 different crops, and not all of those have passed all of the tests. And so we don't have a great diversity in that crop list. You saw some of the examples that I gave. Many of them fall into one plant family, the Brassicaceae, and that's, over a third of our entire approved crop list right now. So that opens you up to the potential for, if a pathogen that specifically affects that plant family comes along, it could wipe out all of your crops. So we need to do more crops, and we need to do a greater diversity of crops to be tested. In terms of the plant microbiome, we have some food safety and plant health gaps. We're likely going to be growing crops in hydroponic systems in space habitats near to midterm. And there are a lot of questions that still remain about how the hydroponic water and nutrient delivery work, and how that the microbiome interacts with that. If you get pathogens, do the native microbes help to mitigate those, or will those become an issue? We also don't really have a great understanding about the reduced atmosphere work. And currently, we really don't have a good way to test that at NASA. Our partners at the Canadian Space Agency do have reduced pressure plant growth chambers, as well as our collaborators in the European Space Agency. But reduced pressures are likely going to be, part of the space habitats moving forward to help crews do extravehicular activities very quickly and easily without requiring a really long pre-breathe and coming back to the higher pressure. It also makes your structures low, less mass and less difficult to build if you're operating at a lower pressure rather than trying to get at 1 atmosphere. So we're probably going to be operating at pressures that are kind of like really high altitudes. And so we don't really know much at all about how plant microbial interactions work, or how many of the plants will grow on those atmospheres. And then radiation is another big open question. We can simulate radiation on Earth using various radiation sources, and we have the Brookhaven National Lab, which has a space radiation beam. But while the total dose may be the same, the duration, the rate of that dose is going to be very different. You might get, enough radiation to mimic a 6-month mission to Mars, but you'll do it in about 3 hours. You don't have 6 months to leave your seeds or your plants there. So we really won't understand deep space radiation until we're out there at the gateway or on the lunar surface. We also have been thinking about, could you breed for or engineer better space crops? And there are a lot of people working on this. NASA has the CUBES Consortium, the Center for the Utilization of Bioengineering for Space, which has been working on this. Trish has funded research on this through the Space Tomatoes from Dr. Jinkerson at UC Riverside. And there's a newly formed group called the Australian Centre of Plants for Space. This will be an Australian initiative for 7 years, developing plants and plant-based products like plant-based medicines and engineered foods. So there's just a lot of interest and work going on in this area, and we're really excited about the potential for that. We feel that targeted plant development could fall into several areas. Plant growth and development, you could go for more compact plants with higher yields, higher harvest index, or which is the ratio of edible to inedible parts, uniform growth. Plant physiology, there are a lot of targets there in terms of stress tolerance or maybe high tolerance to sodium. Because if you start to look at urine as a source of nutrients, getting the sodium out can be very challenging. So if your plants are more tolerant to sodium, that could be hugely beneficial. For nutrition, we want to be in the high normal range for a lot of different factors. For instance, high normal levels of antioxidants and phytonutrients. Organoleptic acceptability, sensory acceptability. We want really good, intense flavor and appearance and color and aroma. We don't want any off flavors or aromas. And then post-harvest is a really interesting area to think about. We want good shelf life of your produce, whether it's on the plant or off the plant. Reduced processing for things like wheat, perhaps, or easy degradation of inedible biomass to quickly recycle that. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit in the last couple of minutes and talk about some of the other studies that are going on not on the space station. CHAPEA, the Crew Health and Performance Exploration Analog, was and is a study that's been going on at Johnson Space Center, and this is the crew of CHAPEA 1. This was a 378-day simulated Mars mission, and crops were a part of this mission. The crew lived and worked inside a 3D printed Mars habitat at Johnson Space Center, and they basically conducted a full-on mission to Mars without leaving the planet. They had time delays, and they had a lot of constraints that you would see in a Mars mission. They entered on June 25th of 2023 and lived in there without direct communication. And one of the things that they got to do as part of this mission were to grow some crops at different points within the mission. And you can see here at their 150 days in space, their Thanksgiving photo. And we looked at crops as part of a diet from an integrated health and performance perspective, along with things like exercise. And, we measured not just the physical health, but the behavioral health as well, as part of this mission. So there are some wonderful podcasts if you want to learn more about this. If you go to Houston, we have a podcast. The crew sent out Mars audio logs of every month of their mission. And it's really interesting to hear them talk about the foods as well as, their connection to Earth, and crops were mentioned pretty often. So we were very interested to hear what they had to say. They exited on July 6th this year. And this is one of 3 planned CHAPEA missions. So we'll plan to start CHAPEA 2 in 2025 in the May timeframe. Crew selection is going on right now, but we'll need larger sample size to be able to fully understand and analyze the data. So we have 3 planned missions to get enough statistical power to really understand the requirements for a future Mars mission based on crew health and performance. Another upcoming and very exciting thing for our team is the LEAF mission, the Lunar Effects on Agricultural Flora. This is being led by a small business in Colorado called Space Lab Technologies, and Kennedy Space Center is partnering along with a number of universities that I've listed here. And we plan to develop a small growth chamber that astronauts will carry to the moon as part of the Artemis 3 mission, deploy and grow plants. We'll have some of those plants returning with the astronauts, and other plants that will be left behind and continue to grow on the lunar surface, and we'll be able to collect data on those remotely. So these will be some different crop plants, and we're really excited to start to understand better the constraints of the lunar environment. So with that, I'm going to stop, give thanks to the different programs and teams that do this research, and the astronauts, of course, as well as the programs that help fund this research, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Gioia. That was wonderful, very insightful. So we've had a few questions through the Q&A channel so far. I'll highlight a couple of them right now. I know we only have 4 minutes or so, and so any that we don't have time to get to, I'll be doing some responses offline, and I'll also send your way in case you and team want to chime in on any of them. One of the questions that we had was about the oven for cooking cookies. I believe the 0G oven. Why is that not being used more? And maybe I responded preliminarily, but if you could elaborate on the status there, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that. That was a commercial venture, but I do know that they were able to bake, I think, 1 or 2 chocolate chip cookies in that. So I think it had a very small volume. I think it took a few hours to bake 1 cookie. So that is a challenge. Something like a baked potato takes considerably longer than a chocolate chip cookie, which normally takes about 10 minutes when I do them in my oven. So I think that's been one of the challenges with that. I haven't heard, the final results from that. I think it's a great idea to pioneer that type of technology. That's exactly what we'll need to do things like, baked potatoes in the future. But I don't really have any further details on that. I think it's exciting and would love to learn more.
Fantastic. Thank you. One other question that's come up earlier was when you talked about water, they're wondering if you have problems with evaporation. If so, how bad? And I'm guessing a part of that has to do with efficiencies of the circulation system.
Yes, exactly. So, plants transpire water to the atmosphere, and it's a process called evapotranspiration. And that water essentially evaporates out of pores in the leaves called stomata, which can be regulated by a variety of factors. So, that's just a natural part of plant growth. And you have to have this because that transpiration stream, the process of moving that water through plants also pulls in nutrients that plants need to grow, like calcium. So if you don't have transpiration, then you don't get enough calcium in your plants for them to produce good cell walls and good leaves and things like that. So we do have evaporation, and that is driven by the gradient between the plant leaf and the atmosphere. In veggie, we're using the space station atmosphere, and that atmosphere is about 40% humidity, 45% humidity generally. So we do have pretty good evaporation from those plant leaves. We go through water pretty regularly. Veggie is what we call an open system. So you add water to the plant rooting pillows, which are kind of our space grow bags. And then that water that comes out of the leaves as water vapor goes back to the ISS environment. We're essentially flowing through that ISS environment. APH has a different approach. APH is what's called a closed system. So instead of having the ISS have to recondense that water vapor and process it, APH is doing that condensation and processing inside the hardware, and it has the ability to recirculate the water. So that approach works really well for APH. But in that case, we have to bring in gases like carbon dioxide. So we actually have to send carbon dioxide to the space station for APH. What we're doing with our upcoming crop production system is trying to take a hybrid approach where we're going to hopefully recycle the water, but be able to take the ISS atmosphere to get the access to CO2 and to give the oxygen back out to the space station. So it's a pretty challenging thing to do, as you can imagine. But we're working on that because otherwise we do have to add a lot of water to the plants, and then the spacecraft itself is doing the recycling, as in the case of veggie. So we're trying to find a happy medium there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gioia. Well, looks like we're at time now. We have a few other questions. Everyone look for your PDF of the slide deck later on. We'll have some of the rest of the remaining questions answered then. And thank you everybody for your time. With that, we'll close out the first webinar in our series for the Future Foods for Space program. Thank you all. Take care.